Thanks for joining me, Molly O'Brien, here on GoLocal Live in the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. It is 3 o'clock on February 27th, Tuesday afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us here today. We're talking all about history, preservation, and then we're going to shake things up and talk a little bit about technology later on this afternoon and some gadgets you can get with a great deal. So I'd like to say hello and welcome to our first guest, Brent Runyon. He's the Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society. Brent, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have a couple of things to talk about today. We're going to talk about your recently released list of the 2018 most endangered properties here in Providence. We're going to talk about some stuff that's been going on, some interesting things, and then of course you have the very popular, very exciting Winter Bash that's coming up this weekend. I know a lot of people are looking forward to that. It's always a huge success. But let's start off talking about a couple things that have been going on with Brown University. A lot of excitement, a lot of feedback happening within the community, and something else that is pretty interesting. News came out that Brown University was looking at building a wellness dorm up near Brown University, obviously, 450 Brook Street. So wanted to get your thoughts on that. You had made some comments. Wanted just to get some insight from you on that.
Yeah, so when they went to do their master plan amendment in December, there were two major components. One, the Performing Arts Center, which I think we'll talk about. Yeah. The other being a wellness dorm, which I'm not really familiar with that concept. We didn't have it when I was in college, but I believe it will be placed on the parking lot on Brook Street, which they built a couple of years ago when they tore 7 houses down that were in bad shape. And so, you know, the community is looking forward to seeing what's going to replace that surface parking lot. So I think that that will be coming up in March at the City Plan Commission hearing. So, you know, we just encourage people to look and watch that and see what they think and weigh in when they want to and be part of the process.
Okay, so again, a lot of focus and attention on these discussions has been on the Performing Arts Center, which there was a lot of community discussion about.
There was. And
recently, I believe it was just last week, that Brown kind of relaunched a plan, likely because there was so much community discussion on this. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. There were 5 buildings that were on the most endangered properties list as part of that proposed Performing Arts Center on College Hill. And again, Brown recently revised their proposal. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on the revised proposal.
We're very enthusiastic about the revised proposal. The new site actually is very close to the one they wanted originally. It's central to their campus, has proximities to other arts uses, but it doesn't require demolition of any historic buildings. It requires moving one. But to a very nearby location, so it preserves the context for the most part of that building. So we feel it's a real win-win for the community and for Brown. The site actually works better for them apparently too. So we're really enthusiastic that because of the community feedback that they got, they were willing to reconsider a site, and it seems that they found one that actually works in their favor. So a win-win all around.
What does this say to you in terms of community engagement, community discussion, community activism when it comes to preservation? How does this issue speak to you?
You know, I feel like as a preservationist, it's really taking part in democracy and showing up at public hearings. People typically only get involved when something's in their backyard, but really things throughout the community affect our lives in ways if we pass by it, if we shop near it, if we know people who live nearby. So it's every month there are innumerable meetings to go to that become part of the process in shaping the future and preserving the past of the city and the state. So we think it's really important for people to participate. Okay,
so continuing the discussion, what do you think comes next for part of this? Again, so no demolition is part of this next this next proposal, but one property could be moved.
One property will be moved. So the next thing is March 20th. City Plan Commission, and they'll present the amendment, and it may be approved. So then once that is, then they can start moving a house and preparing plans, preparing the site. The really important thing at this point is knowing what the design of the Performing Arts building will look like. It's a pretty long street frontage along Angel Street near the Granoff Center, and so we feel it's really important that that new design really addresses and engages the public that will be driving, bicycling, walking by every day, rather than turn the side to it. So the design is really critical, and they have an excellent architect out of New York. So we're optimistic that they can work through and achieve everything they want and what we all feel is best for the community.
Excellent. Let's transition as we work our way through preservation and continuing with the community, talking about some of these endangered properties lists. So continuing to work it, I believe it's just over 15 on the list this year, right?
It keeps growing.
Yeah, it does keep growing, and some of these have continued to make the list. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It means they're still around, so I suppose that's good.
That's true.
But also not a good thing because it means they are still endangered. So let's kind of walk our way through these, just to give people kind of a reminder, a refresher. What classifies an endangered property? Sure.
So, it's basically a property that it could have an immediate danger, such as demolition, which the Brown 5 did until that was withdrawn recently. Or it could be something that's just a large building that has a very difficult use. And in Providence, we've had a lot of those over the years. But as we've seen, all these old mill buildings that didn't have a future in the 90s have now all been, for the most part, rehabilitated into one of several uses. So we believe that if we can keep a building up long enough and keep focus on it so the community knows it's there, they know it's important, that a new use will come along. For instance, I just heard that last night at the Historic District Commission, they announced a plan with the city owns that building, the Bohms Theater on Broad Street. The city owns that building, and apparently an owner from the community is coming forward to preserve the facade, which is amazing.
Awesome.
And to build something behind it for local events. So that's a building that no one really had any hope for, but thanks to the city and some other actors, it looks like it will have a new use.
That is excellent news.
Yeah.
Excellent news. Kind of got chills just there. Okay, so let's talk about one that we all know about that made the list this year. If you don't know about it, then I don't know where you've been. The Industrial Trust Building, also known as the Superman Building. There's been a lot of action on both sides. Kind of what do we do about this? Talk to me a little bit about thoughts on the Superman Building this year.
Well, we like to call it the Industrial Trust Building.
Yes.
However, it's obviously easier to say Superman. Everybody knows it by that name. That building, the state and city have been working to find commercial tenants for it. The owner had looked at residential use. But for whatever reason that we're not privy to, it's stalled. So we think that we need to find a solution in the next year to start attracting some tenants, start rehabbing the building. The limestone is not in great shape, so we're seeing some things crumbling off the building now. So we're really prioritizing that building this year. It's been on the list for a while, ever since it became vacant. So we're really looking forward to having some galvanizing community action and figuring out what to do with it.
Okay, so again, a big priority this year. It is tough. Such a staple within our community. So
yeah, indelible part of the skyline.
It really is. Something that I thought was really interesting. The list, it really grabs you every year. There are so many fascinating properties that we have here in Providence.
Right.
But so when you take a look and you have pictures on the list, it's really interesting to look at it. So we're going to point out a couple to you. So the State House Lawn, 90 Smith Street, Capitol Center, downtown, and Smith Hill. The State House Lawn.
State House Lawn. Well, it's not the first time it's been on.
Okay.
If you look at historic photographs of the lawn, the parking has been increasing every few decades or so. And so in 2014, I believe, the last time they expanded a parking lot, that's when we first started saying, look, that's enough. This is an important landscape. It's where the state gathers for important demonstrations, for meetings, for elections, things like that. And so this landscape deserves more attention. And then when they announced that they would be building an intermodal transit center there, our heads nearly exploded. However, we are working with RIDOT and the developer, who is actually the president of our board, who understands very well the concerns of the Preservation Society, to find a use that honors the landscape but also achieves the goals of the transit center and parking. So we are really optimistic that that plan will come through. It's all dependent on funding, as always.
Always.
But that's a hugely important landscape for the state of Rhode Island.
I think that's so valuable too, because if no one's really speaking up for the lawn at the State House, right? I mean, then it can just go away. And you're 100% right that so many people gather there and use that as a grounds to have very specific rallies and that kind of thing. So it's fascinating.
Absolutely. The state has so many things that they're thinking about every day, from children to seniors to driver's licenses. So it's really incumbent on those of us who are always paying attention to the environment, to buildings, to point these things out and try to get the state a little more focused on something they may have just let go because they've got bigger fish to fry, frankly.
Because they might just think it's grass.
They might. They absolutely might.
They might just think it's grass when there could be a little bit more. Okay, another one, the Water Supply Board Building, which is located at 52 Academy Avenue in Mount Pleasant.
Wow. Well, last year there was an announcement, I don't know if it was speculation or desire by LaSalle Academy to acquire that building and raise it to expand their parking lot. We never think that's a good idea unless the building is really too far gone. But we think since that building was just inhabited, it probably isn't. So we are hoping the city will do some sort of public process to engage people in deciding what the future of that building should be. Perhaps LaSalle can use it. Perhaps part of the building can be saved. We just think that some creative ideas need to come to the fore, and really there should be a public process for what is essentially a building owned by the public.
I think that's an excellent idea, rather than just pave over it. Okay, another one that I think is very interesting and curious to find out how and why it made the list. Parcel 1A, South Water Street, 195 Redevelopment District over on the east side.
Well, a lot of
195 land.
195 land. There are a few parcels there we're worried about, but people may think, well, that's not a historic landscape, right? It was created. Actually, that parcel was not created by the removal of 195. That was the helipad parcel, so it's been there for a while. But when it was deeded to 195 by the city for some reason. The state made very clear that there had to be certain restrictions on that property because of its historic uses, of the placement near the water, and really when you think about it, our shoreline, the river, the bay, those are really sacred places for Rhode Islanders. And so for us to allow something to be built right there that isn't really a public use, that may not be as attractive or whatever the public wants there, then we think that more scrutiny needs to be given. So for us to see a hotel going up that may not look so great, we have to really question that. What is the best use for that property? And so that's why we put it on the list. Not to say that nothing can be built there, but really to call attention to that. If you build something there, it needs to be really darn good.
I love that. And again, these are the kind of things that I think we should all be proud that someone's looking out for us.
Thank you.
Right?
Absolutely.
Looking out for it. There's a couple others out here. What other ones do you want to talk about?
I think that historic religious buildings are really tough.
There's quite a few on the list this
year. I think
our
city is not as religious as it used to be.
There's quite a few churches and synagogues on
there. So, Broad Street Synagogue, which has got sort of a roof on it, needs a real roof. We need to find a new use. It's a valuable property for that neighborhood. A lot of good ideas have been put forward for how it could be used, but we really need to follow through on those. Our Lady of Mount Carmel on Atwells is a new one. Got a call from a developer a couple years ago or actually a real estate agent. They said, is this one protected by anything? Because its highest and best use maybe as a developable lot. Oof. And I said, well, this is a beautiful building. How can we just say it should be knocked down and, what could be put there? So we think that building could probably be reused. Let's talk about that before we talk about destroying it. So those are some of the ones that we're really interested in seeing brought back to life. They're hard to use, but not impossible.
Well, and I feel like there has been so much success over recent years in a lot of these New England towns, I'm just going to say, changing, whether it's mill buildings or churches or firehouses or schools, changing and developing them either into stores or restaurants or commercial properties or into places for people to live. It's fascinating how you can see the transition into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like I said earlier, sometimes you just have to keep a building up long enough to find a new use. And often that's the economy. There's a church on the east side that's turned into condos. I mean, on Atwells Avenue, you would think that people would pay pretty good money to live there or put a bar or restaurant in. They have a few of those over there, right?
Yeah.
So we think there are some uses for some of these buildings, and others it may just take a little more time.
And I think, too, it almost provides a talking point. So, I live in that place that used to be a church. Or I live, plus how Rhode Island is that, right? I live in that place that used to be this.
Yeah.
We had a restaurant in here that it used to be a church or it used to be a bank, and then people filmed like movies in that. So I mean, it continues a talking point and helps with the economy too. Then.
It does, and it's a unique place in Providence that has a history. A lot of people have gone there to school, church, had weddings. Exactly. I mean, it's a place that means something to a lot of people. So things should stick around as long as possible. And by the way, we have plenty of land on which one can build in the city. 195, parking lots downtown. Capitol Center has some lots. There's plenty of land to build. So let's not tear anything else down.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, before we have you go and before we talk about the bash, let's talk about some success stories. You've been doing this list for a couple of years, endangered properties. Where have you seen some success?
Gosh, you put me on the spot. Let's see. We have had some successes, quite a few actually. The arcade, of course, is a good one. Very hard use, but Evan Granoff came up with a really innovative use for that. It won a lot of national awards. Let's see, what else? Most everything downtown that was on the list has been saved, but things aren't coming to me at the moment.
Okay. So, continuing the preservation.
But I will say the Welcome Arnold House on Planet Street, which is on our list. We have heard that the developer's architect is going to be submitting a plan for rehabilitation. So we hope to check that one off as saved this year. So we're really proud of that developer for coming forward with a new idea.
Awesome. Yeah. So you'll keep us in the loop?
Absolutely.
Okay. Keep us in the loop on that. So because it's always about money, right? It
takes money to do this work.
On either side of it, right? It's always about the money. So there is a big fundraiser. The Providence Preservation Winter Bash is coming up. Has won numerous awards because people always love celebrating and always love pitching into preservation. Talk to us a little bit about what's happening this year.
Sure. Well, it's our 15th year doing that event. And speaking of endangered properties, we started that when we had a lot of big empty mill buildings. And this was a way to call attention to them. We have big parties in them. Makes sense. It's a little difficult these days because we're running out of big empty buildings. Well, not all of them, obviously.
Not all of them.
So it's our 15th year. We expect around 500 people to come and just enjoy a lot of really special bites, special cocktails, food from some of our really great restaurants in the area, and also a really good band and DJ and some special performances. So I think with the speakeasy theme, really celebrating a building from that era in a state that was last to even consider ratifying the amendment that created Prohibition, we think that the theme speaks really well to the history of Rhode Island and our special historic places.
It's a really fun party. If you haven't been, you should definitely go. It's worth it. So the Winter Bash Glitz and Glamour Speakeasy Affair, it's coming up this weekend, so tickets still available?
Tickets are still available. Okay. Early bird pricing ends Thursday night, and then they go up by $10 at the door. So really encourage you to get your tickets early for the best deal. We still have VIP tickets available.
Worth it.
And that gets you bottomless bubbles and special bites throughout the evening and special seating as well. Our host sponsor, Alex and Ani, has been great this year in helping us really promote the event. But we have a lot of great sponsors, and we think if everyone comes and wears their best flapper attire, gangster attire, whatever 1920s attire speaks to them, that everybody will have a fantastic time. They always do.
Oh, it's such a fun party. Well, Brent, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for filling us in on some of these properties. We'll, of course, have a link to your website and more information on the bash on our website, GoLocalProv.com. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's always wonderful to hear what's happening in the world of preservation. We're just going to take a quick break to get set up here for our next guest on Go Local Live. I'm Molly O'Brien. Thanks so much for joining us, and we're just going to take a quick pause. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us back here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm very pleased to welcome our next guest. He's an award-winning historian, a Bancroft and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Gordon Wood joins us today. Gordon, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So
my pleasure.
I'm going to give you a few more credits here, but if I did read your whole profile, I think that would take up all the time in our interview. So Gordon is an Alva O. Way University Professor Emeritus at Brown University, and among his many contributions and achievements to history, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. So today we could be talking about many things, but we're going to talk about your latest book, Friends Divided, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So you have a salon series coming up at the Providence Athenaeum Friday, March 16th, starting at 5 o'clock. So if you don't get your fill on the book today, you can always go and hear more from the professor. So once again, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, so let's talk about these two very important figures in our American history. Many people probably know a lot more about one than the other, and you decided to take a deep dive into the two and their relationship. Why did you decide to write the book?
Well, I was going to write on Adams because I had just finished 3 volumes, editing 3 volumes of Adams's writings for the Library of America. But my editor at Penguin, Scott Moyers, said, why don't you compare him to Jefferson? And suddenly the idea intrigued me, and I'm glad I did, because I learned more about each of these men by pitting one against the other. I think I made the right decision based on his suggestion.
Did you have fun looking at the relationship between the two and kind of comparing and contrasting?
Definitely. They differ so much. It's almost incredible that they became friends. They differed on every conceivable issue you could think of. The only thing they had in common was the support for the revolution. Of course, both were radicals. And they had a common enemy in Alexander Hamilton, so that helped to bond them. But otherwise, they differed in their attitudes towards government, towards religion, towards human nature, towards everything you could think of, everything that mattered. So they were different.
How do you think we can look at their relationship today and kind of learn from that? Because you said they were totally two different people, and their ideology totally differed, but they still managed to be friends in the end.
Well, they broke in the 1790s when parties emerged. Adams was a Federalist, that is, he supported the administration, George Washington. He was vice president with Washington, and he succeeded to the presidency in 1796, but Jefferson was his leading opponent. The Jeffersonian Republicans had emerged in opposition to Washington and Hamilton, and so they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they also differed over the French Revolution and the role that America should play in the world. And it was a bitter confrontation that came to a climax in the election of 1800, when they really were opponents. Adams assumed that he would be reelected to the presidency, just as Washington had. And when Jefferson beat him, that was a humiliation, and he was so bitter that he refused to attend, Adams refused to attend Jefferson's inauguration, and they never spoke for 12 years until they were brought together back and reconciled by the work of Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was their mutual friend and wanted these two men, one the prime northerner, and at that point Jefferson was the southerner, and he thought that they represented the two, he thought that both of them represented the two poles of the revolution. They needed to be brought together and exchange ideas before they died. And of course, what's most extraordinary has linked them ever since. They died in 1826 on July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Such a coincidence that most people in the country thought it was providential, that God had somehow dictated this marvelous coincidence.
It really is unbelievable.
Right.
It's so unbelievable that it's almost, you can't believe it.
Of course,
really
it was
happened.
a little managed in the sense that they knew the 4th was coming. They didn't know each of them was going to die at that same time. They were 500 miles apart, and they never saw each other. From 1800 on, and they died in 1826, they never personally met. But on the 3rd, for example, Jefferson knows he's dying, and he says to his doctor, "Is it the 4th yet?" And he said, "No, no, sir, it's only the 3rd." And Jefferson hung on for a few more hours and then let himself go. And I think to some extent Adams did the same thing, although not realizing that Jefferson had died. He said, at the last words he's supposed to have said, "Jefferson still survives." Actually, Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier.
Talk to us a little bit about these two men and their very different upbringing and their very different background, and talk to us about how their background and their upbringing really provided different contextual views on how they believed in democracy and governing.
Right. Well, Jefferson was a patriarch, a planter, slaveholder, and a wealthy man, very wealthy, one of the wealthiest men. He inherited slaves from his father, land and slaves from his father, and also much more land and many more slaves from his father-in-law. So that by 1770, he was one of the wealthiest planters in all of Virginia. But he was a radical in his support for the Revolution, and he wrote a pamphlet in 1774 that was by far the most radical pamphlet that appeared in that whole debate with the imperial debate until Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Now, Adams was very different. He came from a middling background from Quincy. He had very few connections. He didn't dominate Massachusetts at all until he became, through sheer hard work and sheer ability, one of the top lawyer. By 1770, he was by far the busiest and the best lawyer, best attorney in the whole colony of Massachusetts. And most of his wealth, in fact, almost all of it, came from his law practice. But he never became one of the wealthiest members of the Massachusetts society, something that always rankled him. So they came from very different backgrounds. But the irony is that, of course, Jefferson was a radical, and so were his fellow planters. They come from a hierarchical, patriarchal society and very unequal, with 40% of the population enslaved, and yet they are the liberals. They are the popular party of the 1790s. If you talk about limousine liberals, well, the Jeffersonian Republicans and their leadership were limousine liberals. By contrast, Adams comes from a colony which is very egalitarian compared to the South, much more democratic. More people could vote. There are very few slaves left in Massachusetts, and they were all slavery was abolished legally by 1780s. So, but Adams is a Federalist. He's concerned with hierarchy and disorder. He's frightened of the people, but naturally he's frightened of the people because the people are much more unruly, much more powerful, much more volatile in Massachusetts. So you have that paradox where the leaders of the popular party, the Jeffersonian Republicans, are slaveholders who don't have to worry about elections, whereas the Federalists are constantly worried about elections and have have great doubts about democracy.
And you wrote that Adams thought sooner or later Americans' elections would become so partisan and so corrupt.
That's right.
Which, I mean, was he premonition or?
Well, he saw it already happening, but his solution, he said, well, sooner or later we're going to have to go to, first we'll have offices serving for life in the Senate and the President and governors serving for life, but then eventually they'll have to become hereditary so that you could avoid elections. Wow. He felt that elections. That's what he wrote in an essay that came out in 1791. Jefferson was appalled by it, horrified by it, and Adams pulled back. And when he published his essays in a book in 1805, a decade and a half later, he left that essay out because it had become too embarrassing for him, suggesting that we would have to have hereditary offices, the exact opposite of republicanism. But Adams was enamored of the English Constitution and wanted protections from all parts of the government. He's probably responsible for our checks and balances in our constitutions. He was very influential on the state constitution making in 1776. He wrote a pamphlet that was picked up by many of the constitution makers at the state level. And then, of course, he drafted the Massachusetts State Constitution of 1780. And what he contributed more than anything else is that the veto power given to the executive. He wanted an absolute veto, but of course, that was too much for most of his colleagues, and so they had a qualified veto, that is, could be overridden by 2/3 of the legislature. Well, that gets written into the Massachusetts Constitution, which was the first constitution to have that particular veto power, and that's picked up by the in the federal Constitution by the convention in 1787, even though Adams and Jefferson, neither of them was present in Philadelphia when the federal Constitution was drawn. But he had an influence on constitution making and limiting democracy and limiting the few as well. He was much more frightened of the aristocrats than he was of the people. But he's frightened of all power. And insofar as we have checks and balances, Adams deserves a lot of credit for checking power.
And because Adams had all of these, really was one of the founding fathers, why is it that so many of us know Thomas Jefferson so much more? How is it that he is so much more remembered? You wrote in one of your book talks that it's easier, there's all these memorials for Thomas Jefferson. It's easier to get to his house. We can go find him. He's honored in so many more ways, whereas contributions could be looked at similarly.
There's just a difference. There was a difference then, too. The crucial thing was that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that became the source of his fame. Little did he know he would be famous because of that. Neither of them thought that writing the Declaration, making a draft, Adams was so busy. There was a committee of 5, and Adams and Jefferson were both on that committee. But Adams, at the point in 1776, in the spring of 1776, he's serving on 24 committees, chairing many of them, including the Board of War. That is, essentially, he's fighting the war at this point. Jefferson arrives late to the Second Continental Congress, and he's the young squirt. He's 8 years younger than Adams, and so they think. And he had written this pamphlet, and he's obviously a graceful writer. So they assign him the task of drafting the Declaration. And only later, in the 1790s, his supporters, Republican Party supporters, began claiming Thomas Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence. And Adams is appalled. The author, he says, he's a draftsman. And suddenly, the Declaration, especially the part that we now celebrate, all men are created equal, became the rallying call or cry of his Republican Party, and it elevated him into fame. And there was just no way Adams could compete with that, and he just was so upset by that, so jealous, so envious of that fame that Jefferson was getting. And Jefferson came to realize that he was going to be remembered for that. And so he actually he writes his son-in-law and says, I'm going to give you the desk on which I wrote the Declaration. It's going to be a relic, he said. He realized it had taken on religious significance, spiritual significance. And it was just something that Adams just could never get over, the fact that he had missed this moment in history. When they got reconciled, Adams soon came to, they got reconciled in 1812 after these 12 years of silence between them. And Benjamin Rush, who was a mutual friend, closer to Adams than Jefferson, worked at it for 2 years to bring them together. They were reluctant because they had been such bitter enemies, and the election of 1800 was the most scurrilous in our history. We think our press is bad today. It's nothing compared to the 1790s. Although neither of these two men actually campaigned. They stayed, one in Monticello and the other in Quincy, but their followers said things about their opponents that we would find terrible today.
Well, wasn't it a lot of it just totally untrue as well?
Oh, they just made up things.
It was just totally false,
well,
right?
Talk about
fascinating.
fake news.
Yeah, it was so 1790s fake news.
But they came back together and they began exchanging letters from 1812 to their death in 1826. About 158 letters, with Adams writing 3 to every one of Jefferson's. He became embarrassed by that because he was writing so much, and Jefferson said, "Don't mind, I love reading your letters." And then Adams realized that, well, maybe he's got more letters to write than I have. So he asked him. He says, how many correspondence, how many letters did you receive last year? 1820 was the year he asked him about. And Jefferson says, well, I received 1,200 and something. And Adams was appalled. He said, oh, I received only 123 letters. Oh. So he was receiving 10 times less. Fewer letters, 10 times fewer letters. And see, Jefferson, by this point, was a superstar. He was corresponding with the Tsar of Russia, with Alexander Humboldt, the great German naturalist. He was corresponding with people all over the world. Adams had none of that. So Adams immediately realized that he was not in the same celebrity league as Jefferson. And Jefferson has remained way ahead of him. I mean, as you said, Monticello gets 500,000 visitors a year. It's a World Heritage Site. That's not true of Adams's very modest home up in Quincy, which is closed during the off-season. I mean, and of course Jefferson has a great memorial on a tidal basin right off the mall in Washington. Adams has no memorial in Washington. They're just in different celebrity leagues, and Adams knew that right from the start. And it rankled him, but he accepted it reluctantly. He knew that he would be always behind Washington and Jefferson in fame.
Do you see duels, feuds, rivalries, friendships like this? Do you think it was there in the founding of our nation? It seems to still be here 200 plus years later. Do you see these kind of things just playing out over the course of history?
Well, we don't have duels now.
Well, that we know about.
I mean, they lived in a very somewhat different world. It was an aristocratic world in a way that all who lived into the 19th century, and that includes Jefferson and Adams, were appalled by the society they had created. I mean, they really were upset by the results of the revolution. The country was much too democratic for them. It was much too money obsessed. Banking was going crazy. Banks were being created left and right, and paper money was being issued. Now that paper money fed the economic powerhouse that turned the United States into an economic powerhouse. I mean, made the United States be a great economic, but they couldn't understand that. They had no understanding of a bank. Very few people did. Hamilton was one of the few people who understood how a bank worked. So they were not happy with what they had created. And so they, in that sense, both of them died somewhat disillusioned with what they had wrought. Actually, Jefferson had become much more frightened at the end than Adams because of slavery and the impending sectional conflict. They were aware of that. They knew that if the Union broke apart, it would be over that issue of slavery. Adams was always digging Jefferson in the correspondence, provoking him and teasing him. For example, in 1815, Jefferson was an advocate for the French Revolution, complete Francophile, and loved the French Revolution, and Adams was deeply opposed to it. So by 1815, Napoleon had been defeated, and the Bourbons were back on the throne of France. And so what does Adams do? He writes to Jefferson, so, Mr. Jefferson, what do you think of the French Revolution now? And Jefferson takes all of that with good humor. He doesn't respond. He could have easily responded to these kinds of provocations that Adams was making. It's amazing. Jefferson was very polite and valued the relationship so much that he did not want to respond. But the one thing Adams doesn't tease him about is slavery. He knows that's just too sensitive an issue. It is brought up in 1819, 1820 during the Missouri crisis. which led to the Missouri Compromise. But that was the first premonition of for most people that the North and South might break apart over slavery. And Adams talks about it a little bit, but doesn't really push Jefferson on it. And Jefferson expresses real fears of what's going to happen to the country. So there's Adams's view was, look, this is a problem, it's a national problem, but I'm not going to preach to you Southern planters. It's your problem, and I'm going to let you try to solve it. But of course, they couldn't solve it, and neither did Jefferson. Had no solution. By 1820, he's become a fire-eating Southerner, very defensive about his section of the country.
That is fascinating. It's so interesting. If you're curious about more, of course, you can pick up the book, Friends Divided, and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Before we let you go, Professor Wood, I do have a couple fun, just simple questions for you because you are such a notable historian. You've won several awards. So just a couple curiosity questions. I'm curious, your favorite subject or era to read about?
Well, the American Revolution. But I also read a lot of stuff on World War II, which I lived through, so but I think I do that for relaxation, but my professional interest, of course, is the early American period and particularly the Revolution.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice just to read for fun.
Right.
You've written on several presidents. You've written on the birth of this nation. Favorite person in history to study?
Well, I think Washington is a fascinating person and without doubt was respected by all of these men. He stood head and shoulders above them, both literally, I mean, both in fact and figuratively as well. They respected him, and I think without him, the country might have fallen apart in the 1790s. So, and yet he's not a college graduate. But he's not unintelligent, and he read widely. He's an autodidact. He's much more intellectual, I think, than we've realized in the past. He had the gift of silence, as Adams said, and he was a natural leader. He knew, and so we were very fortunate in producing that kind of leader. There's just no doubt that he got us through the Revolution and then became the first president. And really, that was more crucial, I think, in holding the country together, his presidency, than his generalship.
And you have become a major part of history yourself by being such a noteworthy historian, receiving the National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. What was that honor like for you?
Oh, that was wonderful. There were lots of us, of course, about almost 20 people, I think. We had to wait for the president to be free, and so we were lined up alphabetically. That's the way we're
You're down near the end.
And I was next to Philip Roth, and so I got to talk to Philip Roth for almost an hour.
Wow.
Fascinating to talk with him about, because I had read his books through the years, going back to Goodbye Columbus, and so that was what made that whole experience fascinating. I asked him if he would go and write a short story about this event, and he says no, he would never do that, but that's what John Updike would do, he said. So it was a great experience, and the president, of course, was very gracious and had something to say to each of us as he presented the award, because he personally made these from nominations that came to him. He made he made the decision.
Wow, that says a lot. Go from studying presidents and writing about presidents to being selected by a president yourself. That's pretty remarkable. Professor Gordon Wood, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
He will be at the Providence Athenaeum giving a talk on his latest book, Friends Divided. You can see him March 15th if you're curious for more. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sometime soon. All right, we're going to get set up for our next guest here on GoLocal Live in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Please hang tight as we do that. Everyone, welcome back to the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm Molly O'Brien. I'm pleased to welcome our next guest, technology journalist Rick Beretta joins us. He's a contributor to CNET, and he is the Cheapskate blogger. Rick, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Molly?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited to chat with you today. You are a technology journalist, an author, and you scour the web for deals, and you're going to talk to us about some super cool gadgets today, which I'm definitely excited to talk about. You have a couple really good deals and a few that stood out to you. Let's dive right in. The first one, the Wyze camera. I was looking at this. It looks pretty amazing at a great price point.
It is. So Wi-Fi cameras are kind of all the rage these days. People are snapping them up for home security purposes, for keeping tabs on their pet when they're away at work, for watching their porch so that packages don't get stolen, all this sort of thing. So cameras like this have been around for a while, but traditionally they're on the pricey side. It's not uncommon to spend $100, $200 on just a single camera, and then you often have to pay a service fee on top of that for cloud storage for your recording, right? So these things can be pretty pricey. So the Wyze Cam is this guy right here. And as you can see, it's just this adorable little cube, right? It looks like something that should hop out at the beginning of a Pixar movie.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. And so it's a Wi-Fi camera that is, first let me tell you that it ticks all the boxes, right? It does high definition video streaming. It does night vision. It has motion detection. It really does just about everything that you would want from one of these cameras. And Molly, just what would you pay for such a thing? Just throw out a number.
I would guess $200 to $300.
Well, good. That's going to make this all the more exciting. So the Wyze Cam is $20.
That's ridiculous.
It's $20, which immediately makes me think, no, that's too good to be true. Can't possibly work well. Well, I've tested out a couple of them in my house. It works very well. And what's really amazing about it is that when you do these, when you record video, you set up like motion capture or night vision or automatic detection or whatever, you get 14 days of free rolling cloud storage for these videos. So there's no additional subscription fee on top of it. There's no gotcha. It's just a great little product.
So how do they make it so cheap? Because you look at any of these like super intense cameras that are at really great price points. So you look at what we're recording on right now. You look at GoPros. You look at all these cameras that you think are a good price, but they're not. I mean, $20. That's absolutely ridiculous.
How? Right?
Yes.
How?
I mean, how are they doing that? And there's no gotcha.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the company behind this, Wyze Labs, is I think just kind of trying to disrupt the market a little bit. There may well be down the road some sort of higher price premium model or whatever. But what's really interesting is that this is actually now the second version of this camera. This is the V2 model, which was just announced last week. And I thought, oh, okay, well, here we go. This is going to be their more expensive version. But it's not. It's still $20. It just replaces the last version. It's $20. It's got slightly better image sensor, slightly better motion detection, all this good stuff. Still $20.
That's remarkable. And the fact is, and what you said, you kind of nailed it. People are looking at these, installing, you have like the doorbell cam, but you don't even need that. You can hook it up wherever you want. I was looking at their website. You can put them in like in your kid's room to see if they're sleeping okay. You can put them and see what your pet's doing at home, that kind of thing. Do you know, Rick, can you sync multiple of these up if you wanted to do like a low-cost home security system?
Yeah, absolutely you can. In fact, I've set up 2 in my house. I don't think you can get actual live streaming feeds from multiple cameras at once, but you can like literally tap to toggle between one or the other and shift between the various cameras. And that's a great point. For $100, you buy 5 of these cameras, cover your whole house. One thing I forgot to mention, it also does 2-way audio. So not only can you hear what's happening at the other end, you can actually talk to your pet while you're away and then watch while it looks around and tries to figure out where you are.
That's great.
Fun with pets.
I think that's unbelievable. And like you said, kind of just disrupting what's out there already for $20. It'd be fun just to install that. I think, kids can do that, parents can do that. You can invest in that just to be able to talk to your kids, your parents, you know, whatever it is. $20, that's remarkable.
Yeah, it's just one of those too good to be true, but isn't types of deals. And as the cheapskate, makes me very excited. No gotcha to speak of.
Yeah, and what I like about that too is the fact that you've tested it out. You found and feed's pretty good. Haven't had any problems like glitchiness or anything like that.
I haven't. Anecdotally, I've heard from a few readers that they had occasionally the camera would disconnect, and they had to repair it. Wise has been pushing out firmware updates fairly regularly, so firmware updates will fix these kinds of things, and they are still supporting the first gen camera with firmware updates, at least for the time being. So it's not like you're high and dry. Okay. So as with anything, temper your expectations. It is a $20 camera after all. But I'm a huge fan, and I think it's well worth it.
All right, cool. That's for $20. Hey, I'm sold. And if you don't like it, you can always disconnect it and give it to someone else.
Yeah, it makes a great gift.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So we're talking about kind of home security, looking at cameras, that kind of gadget. Let's move on to something that's also super popular. You've discovered a wearable that also really hits the mark and is not a disgusting price point.
Right. So this is new. This is new to market, and something I've just discovered and just started testing for the last couple of days. But I'll give you the quick backstory on this. A couple weeks ago, I saw a headline kind of around the different tech sites, basically saying this $80 Apple Watch knockoff is just as good as the Apple Watch, right? And of course, someone like me, I'm going like, what? Okay, let me see. So here is that product, and I'm just going to hold it up so you can see it.
Cool.
Kind of looks like an Apple Watch,
looks exactly
right?
Like the Apple Watch, yep.
Yeah, exactly. It's roughly the same shape, same kind of form factor. But this is actually not an Apple Watch. It is from a company called Amazfit, which, and wait, it gets better. The company's called Amazfit. The product is called the BIP. It's the Amazfit BIP. So it sounds like I'm just speaking gibberish. But anyway, so this is a new product, and it's actually not even officially shipping in the U.S. yet. It's back ordered until March, but the price on Amazfit's site is $99. Okay, you can actually find it from some Chinese sellers now for $70, $80. That's for the international version. I think what you're going to get here in the U.S. is a straight up English version. But anyway, all that being said, this ticks a lot of important boxes, okay? So it's a smartwatch. It pairs with your phone to give you notifications, to alert you of calendar events, alert you when you're getting a phone call. It has a heart rate monitor. It has GPS. It has a compass. I mean, it does a lot of things that you wouldn't expect at this price point. And it's kind of cute. It's, very stylish looking. Oh, best part, forgot. The battery, I know, I'm so excited. The battery is good for up to 45 days before you have to charge it again. What? Apple Watch, charge it every night. What?
45 days?
Up to 45 days. Depends on how you use it. If you use the GPS a lot, it might be closer to 30 days. But even then, come on.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna Skype in 45 days and see how that watch is doing.
Well, I've had it on my wrist for about 5 days now, and the battery life is still at like 82%. So, I mean, you can do the math. It's pretty impressive.
I can't do the math.
Me either.
I can't do the math. I think that's probably the selling point, because that's the frustrating thing a lot of people say with either their phones or their wearables, is that the battery stinks, and so what's the point?
Yeah, and I don't mind, because I had an Apple Watch prior to this, and I've gotten accustomed to just throwing it on the charger at night, just same as I do with my phone. But when I travel, I don't want to have to bring along yet another charger for the watch. It's a huge hassle, and so I haven't 100% decided, like, am I going to wear this full time now in place of the Apple Watch? But it's making a very strong case, and I'll mention as well that if you remember the Pebble was kind of like the first smartwatch, and it was super popular. But Pebble folded or was bought out last year, and this is really more like a Pebble. It has an always-on screen. It's beautiful outdoors where it's reflective and everything like that. It's kind of low resolution and kind of, not nearly as bright as an Apple Watch or an Android Wear watch, but it gets the job done.
And I mean, and that's really interesting too. And the company that owns Amazfit, I was looking, is an exclusive provider that does wearable technology. So that's good to know. It's not just some random startup, right?
That's true. And I was hoping you were going to take a stab at pronouncing that company name because I can't. Starts with an X. That's all I can.
But it's worldwide. No, it's known worldwide.
Yes, it's a global brand, and so I think this is they have a couple of fitness watches, I think, that are priced about $200, but this is the first stab at something that's much more consumer oriented and priced under $100, and it's going to be interesting. I think this could kind of be a market disruptor as well.
Cool. Well, Rick Broida, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been awesome to chat with you. Hopefully we can chat again soon. You have the latest and greatest products that we can all actually afford.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to come on anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll put links and information on our website, GoLocalProb, if you're interested in any of these gadgets. And, of course, you can always follow Rick Broida on any of his social media platforms. He's a contributor for CNET as well. I'm wrapping up here in the Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Center. Molly O'Brien, that's Go Local Live for the 3 o'clock hour. Kate Nagel kicks things off with all things news and politics in just a moment. Thanks so much for joining us.